And thank you to all the friends of the Plymouth District Library. I'm honored that you're here today to join us. And I'm honored to know anybody who's a friend of a library. Libraries are important institutions of knowledge, and I think knowledge and facts matter. Thinking about evolving the model of libraries, I think, is really important, but I'm confident they'll continue to play an important role in society. So I thank you for your stewardship of the library. Well, I want to talk to you today a little bit about, I think the title of my talk here is something like Liberty, Public Safety, and the Rule of Law. And I want to talk about the importance of nuance when it comes to those things. And as friends of the library, I'm sure you can understand and appreciate the importance of facts and nuance. And I find that in our society, we have this curious situation where we have more information available to us than ever. And yet, I feel that we are relying more and more on brief and extreme sound bites at polar ends of the political spectrum without appreciating the nuance and the shades of gray that come in between. And there is so much room there for us to think about. The idea that people have to be all or nothing. You have to be all in favor of something or all against something. You know, like all things, there are some good and bad aspects of most things. And if we can figure out ways to maximize the good and reduce the bad, then that seems like the best way to go. So with that in mind, let me talk a little bit about some thoughts I have from a law enforcement perspective about reimagining public safety. I have some slides I thought I'd use so that you don't have to look at me the whole time, and we can keep it a little more interesting. But as you heard Pam say in the introduction, I consider myself mostly a prosecutor. From 1998 until 2017, almost 20 years, I worked as a federal prosecutor, and I spent a lot of time with law enforcement. And so from that perspective, I've had a chance to watch a lot about what's going on in public safety and to think about it. And, you know, we live in these highly politicized times. And so we've got foreign adversaries trying to drive us apart, and we have politicians trying to drive us apart. And division may be good for campaigning, but it's not very good for governing. And it's certainly not good for forming a more perfect union. And we've been told sometimes that we have to take sides on issues when it comes to public safety and policing. We either have to believe that Black Lives Matter or that we should respect law enforcement. And I believe this is a false choice. I think that we can choose both. I think that we can value civil liberties and comply with COVID-19 masking protocols, for example. And when we push people to polar extremes, it may make for a passionate stump speech, but it's terrible for a democratic Republican or republic in a country that is pluralistic and relies on compromise to get things done. So how do we advance public safety in a world that is so divided? Well, it requires us to do something that we all certainly are capable of doing, and that is to hold two ideas in our head at once, right? We've got plenty of room in our brain. We need police, and we should work harder to protect Black lives. Those are two different things, but they're not incompatible. And I, for one, believe that we are up to the challenge. I think we can say Black Lives Matter and support our police. I do both. And I think based on my 20 years in law enforcement, I've met police officers who are some of the best people I know, who go to work every day trying to make a difference, who chose their profession knowing that it was overworked, underpaid, dangerous, and risky. But they did that because they want to protect people. But at the same time, I think we're seeing a crisis in America with a number of police shootings that I think was invisible to us until recent years because of the advent of the cell phone with a video camera and the body-worn cameras that police officers are wearing these days, as well as the dash cams. We are now seeing what our Black friends have told us is true for decades, and that is that police enforce the laws differently when you are a person of color. I know that some of my friends feel personally offended when they hear things like policing is racist or there is discrimination in policing. But I think we're talking past each other when we recognize that there are disparate impact in policing and yet we have most police officers who are respectful, non-racist people. And so how can we have this disconnect? And I think it's because not that individual officers are racist. You know, sometimes you hear this phrase, there are some bad apples out there. And that's true. There are people, like in every organization, there are some who are not fit to be doing the kinds of work that requires public interaction. But by and large, they are. And I think it's the real reason is that because there is systemic racism in all of our institutions. Racism is an ugly word, and it should be because it's an ugly concept. But I think we have to stop taking racism as a personal attack and understand that it's not us, it's the system. It's the product of hundreds of years of history, a history that includes slavery, a history that includes Jim Crow. And only by recognizing it and identifying it can we hope to end it. I once had a chance to travel to the University of Mississippi in Oxford, where for many years they denied admission to black students. I was there for the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the admission of James Meredith as a student there. And rather than deny their history or pretend it had never happened, the universities really embraced that history because they recognize how wrong it was and they want to remember it and identify it and talk about it so that they can overcome it. And the president of the university took us on a tour and showed us the bullet holes on the green in the trees that occurred when there was a student uprising in response to the admission of a black student. And I think the rest of our country would do well rather than to try to bury racism and pretend it doesn't exist and pretend it's over, and acknowledge it and recognize it and do our best to try to end it. So I thought I'd share just some examples of the kinds of racial disparities that cause me to believe that our policing system continues to have some remnants of racism that we need to address and understand and work to overcome. So Ferguson, Missouri is one example. You will recall, I'm sure, the 2014 killing of Michael Brown. And after that happened, the Justice Department went in and investigated police practices in that community. Now, one of the things they found was that the officer, Darren Wilson, did not commit a crime when he shot Michael Brown, that they believed that he had acted in the heat of the moment, in fear and panic, and fired the fatal shots that killed Michael Brown. But the other thing they concluded was that the practices in that community were creating a system that was disparate and unfair against its black residents. They found that the city was using fines and fees as a method to generate revenue, particularly from its African American community. They had something like 67% black and something like less than 5% black police officers on the force. And a huge percentage of the people who received these fines and fees were African American. And if they were unable to pay their fines and fees, then those citizens would be jailed. And so as a result, some of the officers started to see the residents who lived in African American neighborhoods less as constituents to be protected than as potential offenders and resources for revenue. And the inability to pay those fines led to jail sentences for poor members of the community, most of whom were African American. And this focus on generating revenue created a distrust in that community between police and members of the community that became toxic. Police cannot be effective when they don't have the respect of the community they serve. And when police lose legitimacy, people are less likely to comply with the law. And it was against that backdrop that we saw this police encounter between Michael Brown and Officer Wilson. We saw Michael Brown who perceived the police as the enemy, and an Officer Wilson who perceived the community members, this young black man, as the enemy. And one of the things that was said at that time is in a very dry forest, it takes only a small spark to ignite a terrible forest fire. And that's what happened in that community when there was that shooting. There was all that great deal of unrest. And I think it's an example of the kind of systemic racism that can poison a police department. Michael Brown and Darren Wilson really didn't have a chance because of the toxic environment they were living in. The other area of systemic racism, I think, is that we've seen is the number of citizens killed by police. And I'm sure, you know, all these names will sound familiar to you over recent years. All of these people were black people, lying in their bed, sitting in their car. One was a child playing on a playground. We've heard all these names. And of course, white people get killed by the police too, but not at the same rate. Law enforcement itself doesn't track the data of police killings of civilians, which is itself a problem. It's one area of needed improvement, I think. But the Washington Post has tracked police shootings since 2015. And what they have concluded is out of 5,400 fatal shootings, 32% of the victims were black. And keep in mind that the black population is only 13% of the overall population in our country. And so if it seems like more black people are getting killed than white people by police, it's because they are. Now, I suppose there are a number of factors that go into that. One is that police officers have difficult jobs that require them to make split-second decisions. But the data shows they are far more likely to shoot and kill a black person than a white person. And I think some of those disparities can be explained by geography. Crime occurs in areas of high poverty, which correlates to residents who are more likely to be black. But I think rather than thinking about whether the officer is being racist when he shoots, I think instead we should look at the racial disparity in the results. And so this racial disparity among victims of police shootings is a type of institutional racism. It doesn't mean someone had a discriminatory intent. It didn't mean that the officer was racist. It meant that the way we are allocating our resources and the way we are doing business is creating this result of having black citizens being killed at a much higher rate than they exist in the population. And then the third disparity I want to talk about is the incarceration rate. Black Americans are incarcerated at a rate 5 times higher that of white Americans. Even if people working in the criminal justice system are not engaging in any intentional discrimination based on race, this, I submit to you, is a racist outcome. It means that if you're born in this country and you are black, you're 5 times more likely to end up in prison than if you're white. And so how does this happen? Well, I don't believe that anyone is born with a greater propensity to commit a crime than anyone else. But I think that when you have poor communities with high crime rates, they tend to be over-policed and yet under-protected. So poor communities with high crime rates are disproportionately African American. And in high crime neighborhoods, police officers are more likely to use aggressive tactics to fight crime, like stop and frisk, where they stop people on the street corner just because their sixth sense told them that there was something suspicious about them. Now, maybe they'll say, well, sometimes it results in finding weapons or drugs that I wouldn't otherwise have found. But in these same neighborhoods, when residents call police to report a crime, the police are slower to respond than in other neighborhoods like Plymouth or Ann Arbor or West Bloomfield because they're under-resourced and overworked. So when police officers in Detroit and other cities that have high crime rates, when they show up to work, they're already several calls behind. And so these twin factors of over-policing yet under-protecting can lead to community distrust in police. And so I don't think the problem is that we have racist officers, but it's a system that has followed these racist origins to create something that I think is fair to call racist. At least it's something that has a disparate impact, and maybe that's a more palatable way, a more nuanced way to say the same thing. And so I believe that we need to end some of these practices if we want to live in the kind of country that we claim to be, one of equal justice under law, and one where people respect law enforcement, which makes them legitimate, which means that people are more likely to comply with the law. And so what kind of solutions exist out there? Well, one of the things that government has worked on in recent years is a task force on 21st century policing. This was put together by a group of law enforcement officials, academics, police officers, defense attorneys, judges, people with expertise in law enforcement who put together this report in 2015, and they developed something they called the 6 pillars of improving policing. It was about building trust. It addressed policy and oversight, how to use technology to improve policing, the importance of community policing, training and education for officers, and officer wellness and safety. And so maybe I'll just mention a couple of those. I saw firsthand some examples of some of these ideas in action, and they worked. Building trust, for example, is such an essential part of successful law enforcement. In Metro Detroit, we have a program called AllPact. It is a group that stands for Advocates and Leaders for Police and Community Trust, where once a month, leaders from police departments and community organizations get together to discuss issues of mutual concern and learn about the needs of each other. So some of the topics have included the use of tasers. What are the policies on them? How does the community perceive them? Racial profiling, what is the policy from the law enforcement agency and how is that perceived in communities? Stop and frisk policies is another one. I attended those monthly meetings for 8 years, and I saw great progress in enhanced trust between police and community leaders. And so when an incident would occur in Detroit, like we had when I was in office, we had the FBI shooting of an imam. We had shootings of citizens in Dearborn. We had a shooting in Ann Arbor. Police and community stakeholders were able to convene quickly to talk about these situations, to share information before tempers could flare, and by engaging leaders in community organizations to help calm community tensions so they wouldn't erupt. If there's a reason that we haven't seen the kind of civil unrest in Detroit that maybe we've seen in other cities after police shootings, I think part of it is because of those relationships that have been built through groups like AllPact. And that AllPact model, which is led by the Michigan Department of Civil Rights and the Michigan Roundtable on Diversity and Inclusion, has now spread from Detroit to Flint, Saginaw, Lansing, Jackson, and some cities in West Michigan. And I think that model can work in cities across the country. Police departments can only be effective if they have the trust of the communities they serve, and by having those dialogues with community groups, I think we can build that trust in a way that's really important. The police can't be seen as an occupying army that shows up just to, round people up and arrest them and charge them and put them in jail and throw away the key. They have to be perceived as members of the community who are working to enforce the laws to make it safe for the rest of us to live, work, and play. Another part of the pillars of the 21st Century Task Force on Policing is oversight and accountability. And so that is something that I think has been missing for the last 4 years and has accounted for what we're seeing in terms of increased crime rates. One of the things that has been around since 1992, when there was the Rodney King incident out in Los Angeles, was the passage of a law that permits the Department of Justice to investigate police departments who are engaging in patterns or practices of unconstitutional policing. The enforcement of this law was very robust during the Bush administration and then again in the Obama administration. In Detroit, we had one such case. My former office led a review of the Detroit Police Department, which was found to be using excessive force, resulting in the deaths of 7 suspects in custody, the arrest of material witnesses without probable cause. If they wanted to find out where a suspect was, they would go arrest that person's wife or girlfriend and lock them up until they told the police where the suspect was located, even though there was no probable cause to believe that that person had done anything wrong, which is an unconstitutional seizure under the Fourth Amendment, and deplorable conditions in holding cells in confinement that resulted in a number of deaths. We worked with the police department. We brought in expert assistance and reached full compliance. I give a lot of credit to Chief James Craig, who led the police department out of that consent decree and reached full compliance. And today, I think the Detroit Police Department is much stronger and more effective as a result of that work and the expert advice and help they were able to get to rewrite policies, improve their training, use dashboard cameras, and develop management techniques so that they could identify people who had problems. In the past, they had simply transferred people who had disciplinary problems using excessive force to other departments and other units where their supervisor didn't know about their past problems. And so they now have a tracking system that allows supervisors to understand disciplinary problems that officers have. And I think one of the reasons that Detroit was able to get through some of the unrest of last summer is because of the work that was done. In the last administration, we saw Attorney General Jeff Sessions suspend all consent judgments with police departments. He said, we're not going to do these anymore because I believe there was a political effort to look pro-police, tough on crime. And I think that missed really the importance of nuance, that sometimes police departments need help. In fact, Dearborn Police Department raised its hand during the Obama administration and asked the Justice Department to come in and help after they suffered 2 police shootings. And they did a great program of self-improvement on policy training and community involvement in their work. So far, we've seen Attorney General Merrick Garland, the new Attorney General, resuscitate this program. He has announced that the Justice Department will be doing these pattern of practice investigations in Minneapolis and Louisville, which are the cities that had the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor incidents. And I think it's an important oversight tool that can help police departments improve their strategies. I think most police departments yearn to have these kinds of good practices and just don't know where to begin and don't have the resources to begin. And so bringing in some of those national resources can be very helpful. And then finally, training, I'll mention on that list how important training is to effective policing. Officers need to understand some of the modern data and knowledge and thinking on encounters with citizens. For example, implicit bias training. I think we recognize it in so many places. We saw the judge in the George Floyd case give a jury instruction to the jurors on the implicit bias that they may have and that we all may have when we encounter people. And it's not something we should be ashamed of. It's something we should admit and acknowledge, identify, recognize, and manage in the same way we recognize other challenges that we have. And so when we see police officers who may overreact when the person on the other end of an encounter is Black, we need to train police officers to understand what's going on there and manage the implicit biases that they have that are no fault of their own, but may exist. And to deny those in the name of being pro-police is not going to make police officers or departments any better. We need them to get training on de-escalation tactics so that they can try and calm people down before firing their weapons. We need to help police officers learn to deal with mental illness and addiction and youth who may not respond to verbal commands the way we might expect them to. We have to train people on using force when it is necessary in a way that preserves life, but also putting people in positions that aren't dangerous. One of the things that we learned, if you watch the George Floyd case and the trial, was the danger of putting people in that prone position with hands handcuffed behind their back on their stomach is itself inherently dangerous because of something called positional asphyxia. And a person once subdued should be turned on their side. All of those things are so important for training. And so it costs money to do that, and we need to invest in our police officers to help them do their jobs. And the final one on that list that I'll mention is officer wellness. Officer wellness is so important, and it's something that has been traditionally disregarded. Police officers are supposed to be stoic and strong and unyielding and not to need any help. Think about what officers deal with. They experience daily trauma in exchange for very modest pay. They are the first to the scene of a fatal car accident. They show up at grisly homicide scenes. They enter homes where children are the victims of horrific abuse. And we expect them just to show up to work the next day. The Capitol insurrection, I think, is a great example of police officers. We had one who died of a stroke after fighting off rioters at the Capitol, and 2 others who committed suicide within days of that incident. I think we really need to pay attention to the mental health needs of police officers so that today's trauma doesn't trigger tomorrow's violent encounter with a citizen. I think one of the things that officers I've talked to said is, they develop a callousness to dealing with people as a coping mechanism. And so we need to learn more about that and help them by providing the counseling and treatment they need to work through those really difficult and traumatic things that they encounter. And there are many more provisions in this task force report, and I'm hopeful that the next administration will breathe some life into its pages. I also think that we need to do a better job in terms of how we punish criminals who commit crimes. We have a situation in our country where we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of its prisoners. So think about that. 1/4 of all the people in prison in the world are here in the United States. We also have extremely lengthy sentences, a lot of 3 strikes you're out laws that send someone to prison for life after their 3rd felony. We have a number of very harsh drug penalties for drug distribution. And we pay to incarcerate a single offender for 1 year more than $30,000. Imagine what we could do with that money if instead of sending a drug offender to prison for, say, 40 years, if we send him for 7 years, and we recoup the $30,000 a year we pay for those other 33 years with the time value of money. There's probably someone out here who can crunch financial numbers. For every offender who's there, we could spend that money on so many good things. Things like treatment programs and prevention programs and schools and jobs and daycare and fixing our roads and all kinds of things. And so I think that we need to rethink how we spend our resources. You know, there was a time in the 70s and 80s when crime rates were going up, and so it became fashionable for politicians to talk about locking up super predators and throwing away the key. And as a prosecutor, I have certainly prosecuted many people who I believe belong in prison, some for a very long time, because they committed crimes where they abused their place in society. They preyed upon other people, either because they were more powerful physically, or they abused financial power, or they abused political power. But there are many people, I believe, who are going to prison for too long. And if there is a way to reinvest some of those funds into other things, then I think we can be a community that thrives rather than locks up and forgets about some of our citizens, most of whom, by the way, come back from prison at some point, and now they can't get a job because they have a felony conviction. So I think we need to think about who we lock up, for how long, and what to do with them when they're out. If we shun them, even after they've paid their dues to society by refusing to give people a job, I think it is only fair to expect that they may return to a life of crime to be able to afford to live. So there's a lot of room for nuance in that arena as well. And so I think that tough talk from politicians about locking people up is not really the kind of nuance or thoughtful policy that is going to make a difference. So some of the things there's a lot of talk these days about defunding the police, and I think that if we want to have better policing and better outcomes in our criminal justice system, we actually need to invest more there. But I also think it can be accomplished by reallocating some of the funds that we're using. So some of those funds that we're using, the $30,000 a year to lock people up for very, very long periods of time, I think we could reinvest those funds in a lot of ways that could prevent crimes from happening. And prevention is so much smarter, right? Because then nobody has to go to prison if that crime is never committed. And even more importantly, no one is the victim of crime, which I think is perhaps even more appealing to think about. And so rather than talking about defunding police, I think we should think about investing in smart strategies. And I think it's a good strategy for thinking about how we want our community to fund things, educational opportunities, job training, drug prevention, treatment, and mental health, I think would provide the opportunities that some at-risk young people lack and might prevent them from entering a life of crime. There's some statistic that says 2/3 of offenders upon release from prison will re-offend. Well, it really shouldn't come as any surprise to us if we aren't giving people a second chance, because all of the obstacles they had before they went to prison still exist, only now they have a felony conviction on their record, making it harder for them to get a job. One solution that is going on right now in Southeast Michigan that I'd love to tell you about is something called the Community Policing Innovation Initiative, and that is a pilot project to experiment in innovations in policing. A first round of grants was just awarded. I'm the chair of the steering committee that has a number of people from law enforcement and judges and community groups. The grant applicants are police departments and community partners, and it's funded by the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan, the Hudson Weber Foundation, the Balmer Group, and Oakland County has agreed to match grant funds for police departments in Oakland County. And Farmington Hills were both awarded the first round of grants. So here are some of the ideas that are happening in our own community with this initial round of grants. So Canton, your neighbor right there, got a grant to work on citizen oversight of police complaints. So if somebody complains about an officer, it just doesn't go into a black hole somewhere, or it isn't just the police supervisor who looks at it. Citizens are going to look at it to learn more about what the complaints are and what they think is an appropriate response to that complaint. In Dearborn, they got a grant to look at collect data regarding stops in East Dearborn. Who's getting stopped? There are, at least anecdotally, there's a belief that people get stopped there for driving while black, and no data has ever been collected to see if that's true. So they're going to start collecting that data to see if they can figure out whether they have disparities so that they can begin to address them. In Detroit, they're going to start doing some citizen surveys to complement something they just started where they do community summits. They bring in community members to talk about the good and the bad of policing, and then they're going to use that to develop surveys and questionnaires to see, are these just anecdotal issues or are these problems that are existing community-wide? As I mentioned, Farmington and Farmington Hills have a joint grant program where they're going to do community forums to address the history of disparities in policing and try to come to some reconciliation. There is complaints from members of the community that there has been an effort to keep all the black people south of 8 Mile. And that is a belief in Farmington and Farmington Hills among people of color. And they want to have some community forums to talk about that history and acknowledge the pain and trauma of some of the people living in that community and begin to reconcile. I think there's a thought that police officers who show up and do their jobs well just don't understand this kind of history that has occurred. And so putting themselves in the shoes of the citizens that they encounter every day can really be helpful in terms of building the empathy they need to be effective police officers. And Inkster is doing something really interesting. They want to hire social workers to assist with responding to mental health or addiction or youth-driven crisis situations. So rather than having the police be the ones to show up alone and try to manage some kind of situation, they're going to bring social workers along with them to just try to de-escalate and talk down and understand maybe what a person is going through when they're trying to end these encounters without resorting to violence. So I'm excited about those. So round one, as I mentioned, was just awarded. There's a next round for grant applicants. The deadline is August 1st for more police departments to participate. And the requirement is that it be the police department and some community group working together to address these things, because the goal is that these should be community-based solutions. And so let me just wrap up by saying that I think that we are seeing a really interesting crossroads right now in American society. And I think it's driven in part by the fact that we are a multicultural, pluralistic society who come at problems with different histories and experiences. But there are those who want to exploit political divisions by using divisive rhetoric to force us to choose sides, as if there are only two choices in this world and only two things to choose from. When I go to the buffet line, I like to see dozens of choices. When I choose an ice cream flavor, I like 31 flavors. And you should be able to choose all of those things. We all want the same big picture things, I believe. We want to live in a country that is safe and just. And I believe that we can have both. We can believe that Black Lives Matter and that we should support the police. I think we can believe that we can invest sufficient resources into public safety. But that means being a little more creative by investing in mental health and education and jobs. And yes, maybe it takes more police officers in some places to have the kind of community where we can all live and thrive. But that takes people who can hold two ideas in their head at once and resist this lure of tribal politics. And so I think that we all need to do our part to rise above the division and do what we need to do to make our communities better. And so with that, I will just challenge all of you to talk with your neighbors and your friends and your family about the need to respect nuance and to resist the urge to join a tribe, to paint yourself red or blue. we're all in this together. And I think at some point, we're going to get past this moment in history where technology and politicians are driving us apart and return to the things that matter. But it's not going to happen on its own. You know, there's uh, a quote, something like, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But I don't believe it bends on its own. I believe it requires all of us to push to bend it toward justice. But I'm hopeful that with thoughtful people like you, we can get there. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop there, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions that you might have about this topic or any other.
So again, Carol here from the library. Please type in your questions into the chat box. The first question we have, Barb, is related to gathering of data. Can you confirm that there is not a national database that counts the number of citizens that were killed by police, and what type of accounting is done on that today?
Yeah, that is correct. There is not any national database that does any counting on who's killed by police. The data I shared came from a study that the Washington Post has been doing since 2015. They have been collecting that data. But one of the things that task force recommends is to collect that data, right? I mean, think about every other business. Before you can begin to solve a problem, you have to have a full picture of the problem. And so understanding police use of force and other things. I think police are sometimes reluctant to share that data because I think they're worried that it can be used against them in ways that is unfair, or it can, be skewed. But I think that we just can't be afraid of facts. Facts are what they are. And if they tell an unflattering story, but there's a good reason behind it, then we need to trust that we can tell that story and understand it. But there is not any national database. The FBI collects some data on crimes. When people are charged with crimes, they collect that, but they don't collect data related to stops.
Our next question is, I guess also associated with the collecting of data. What about collecting data for the National Health Association regarding the costs and incidents of gun injuries and deaths?
I don't know what is collected there, but that certainly is a high cost. And I think it's so wise to think about some of these problems as public health issues as opposed to solely crime issues. Gun violence is something that is one of the leading causes of death, and I think that's something that we need to think about. So many of these issues, when it comes to crime or violence, violence in the home, domestic violence, all of these kinds of things contribute to health challenges. And so I think collecting data there, but I don't know what data is collected in the health sector.
And Joe would like to know, what were your thoughts when you heard about Kilpatrick's release?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, mixed thoughts, I guess. I mean, on the one hand, I've had other people that I have prosecuted receive clemency of some sort, a pardon or commutation of a sentence. And I've always viewed that as I'll do my job and the president does his, which is to study all of the people who've applied for clemency and make a decision based on a number of factors that the Office of Pardon Attorney recommends, like whether the person expressed remorse or has demonstrated a particular ability to do better and contribute in society in some unique way. And my only concern with regard to Kwame Kilpatrick and other people for whom Donald Trump awarded clemency is they didn't go through the normal process and the normal channels. Instead, it seemed that in the Trump administration, the people who got clemency were those who were powerful, wealthy, or well-connected. And instead of applying it through the uniformity of the Office of Pardon Attorney, we saw Kwame Kilpatrick get relief, but not his co-defendant, Bobby Ferguson, whose conduct was less egregious and got 21 years instead of 28 years in prison. Now, we recently saw the sentencing judge, Nancy Edmonds, award clemency to Bobby Ferguson for compassionate release on the theory that he could develop COVID-19, I think, which I don't know if I would agree with all of that, but I do agree that it seemed only fair to grant him clemency in some shape or form after Kwame Kilpatrick received clemency. But there's another defendant. The person who was sort of the comparable for the Kwame Kilpatrick sentence was a man in Ohio, in Cleveland, a county commissioner named Jimmy DeMora, who also committed crimes very similar to those of Kwame Kilpatrick, extortion and bribery relating to public contracting, had also received a 20-year sentence. And, nobody went to bat for him. He didn't know anybody who was rich or famous or powerful. So he's still doing his 28 years. And so I just thought that if you're going to have a clemency program, it has to be administered fairly and uniformly. And I don't think that was done in the case of Kwame Kilpatrick.
Thank you. Next question. Why don't police shoot to injure rather than kill?
Police are trained to shoot to eliminate the threat. And to eliminate the threat usually requires shooting in the torso, which is what they do. Once they make the decision to shoot, they want to eliminate the threat. If they merely shoot someone in the leg, that doesn't prevent the person from continuing to threaten their lives or the lives of others. They're permitted to use lethal force if they believe the person presents a threat to their life or the lives of others. I know we see the cowboy movies where they just shoot the gun out of their hand, but I think that in the heat of the moment and in that situation, officers are trained to stop the threat. And so I think that means typically shooting to kill.
Thank you. The next question is, can you explain how county sheriffs can disregard the governor and the state laws that are in place seemingly without consequences?
I don't think they should be permitted to do that. I suppose you may be referencing, we saw some sheriffs who were violating COVID-19 orders quite publicly and refusing to enforce laws. One of the interesting things about the state of Michigan is that sheriffs are elected by their county constituents. And so if they are not performing their duties, then the remedy for that is to vote them out of office or recall them. And if the members of that community are in favor of what that sheriff is doing, then you're probably not going to get that remedy. I don't think sheriffs are above the law, and so you could arrest a sheriff just as you could arrest anyone else. I don't know that anybody got arrested for violating masking protocols. I think people were ticketed, so you could ticket a sheriff for refusing to comply, I suppose. But speaking out against them and other kinds of things, I think there's really only a political remedy for that.
Next, can you expand upon the goals of the citizen initiative? And this customer patron says that they wanted to share that they're really glad this is happening and thank you for sharing this effort.
Yes, you can find more about it on the website of the Hudson Weber Foundation or the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan. But these are grant, requests for proposal have gone out to communities. And some are being driven by police departments themselves. Some are being driven by community groups in the communities. But they have to both partner. They both have to sign on to this application and say, we want to do this together. And it may be that some departments aren't ready to make that step because it does require some openness, some willingness to work and expose themselves for what their practices are. But we've found that police departments are actually really eager to do this work. When we had an initial webinar just about more information about the program to answer questions, we had 70 police departments join. The funding in the first round was only such that we could grant 5 applications. I think at that time we had $200,000 to award. But in that time, we've raised $1.5 million from these other organizations to award in the next round. And so we're hopeful that more of those 70 communities that have expressed interest can receive grant opportunities. But I think this is one of those places where there is a little bit of a myth that, it's the community versus the police. Police departments themselves want to do many of these things. They understand that they need the trust of the community they serve if they're going to be effective. I mean, nobody wants to go out and be hated by their own community, right? They want to be part of the community. They work hard. They sacrifice. They want to be beloved in their communities. And so this is a way to try to improve those relationships. So they're very eager to do this. And so any group that wants to, you can reach out to me and I'd be happy to send you information about the application. But either the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan or the Hudson Weber Foundation websites have information for the application of how communities can apply for one of these grants. But it's great. There is guidance in developing this, so they don't have to do it on their own. What they get with the grant is technical assistance to develop their action plan. I mean, they have to come up with a proposal that this is the problem we want to work on. But they get expert assistance to come in and say, We're going to help you develop an action plan. We're going to conduct the training and development of the plan to help you. And then we're also going to help you measure it to determine whether it was successful. So it's really exciting. So even if communities feel like, we'd like to do this thing, but we don't even know how to get started, that's fine. This is for you. You really just have to come together with police and community and say, this is the problem we'd like to solve. And the application itself gives a menu of options. It has kind of 5 general types of programs that can be done, from data collection, de-escalation training, community summits and dialogue, exploring alternatives to policing. And so by looking at one of these menus of options, they don't have to come up with all the ideas on their own.
The next question is really an observation. Is that a figurine of Ruth Bader Ginsburg?
It is, yes, thank you. It is a Ruth Bader Ginsburg action figure. And so the story of that is we have this great tradition at Michigan Law School. It is an auction to raise money for students who want to work in the public sector. So a lot of the summer jobs that students can do are very lucrative. They can go to law firms and make many thousands of dollars over the summer. But there are other students who would prefer to work as prosecutors or public defenders or nonprofits in legal aid and other kinds of things. And so to give those students a stipend to pay their expenses over the summer and make that an option for students who may have a lot of student debt and other things, we do this great auction every year where we auction off all kinds of items to the public and to other students who are going on to these lucrative law firms. And one year I was the auctioneer, and so I threw in a few fun little items like a Michigan basketball jersey that I had purchased myself and one of these action figures. And when I got the action figure, I liked it so much that I got one for myself. And so there it is. RBG inspires me every day in my office.
Thank you. The next question asks, does civil asset forfeiture, AKA policing for profit, provide incentives for police departments to go after some crimes and ignore others? And I guess let me ask that first question.
Yeah, so asset forfeiture. So as a concept, I don't oppose it. Criminal civil asset forfeiture, I think it has a very good idea behind it, which is criminals should not profit from their crimes. And so if you are a drug dealer and you use your money, you put it into a bank account, or you buy a house or a fancy car, and you're caught and you're convicted, and it can be traced that those are the drug proceeds, the government can forfeit those things and then typically sells them at auction and puts the money in the taxpayer pot. So not bad. That seems like a good way to go. Where it becomes problematic, I think, is in this thing called civil asset forfeiture, which is what the person asked. Civil asset forfeiture allows the police to detain somebody based on probable cause, which is a lower standard than the guilt beyond a reasonable doubt necessary for a conviction. Based on probable cause, if they stop someone, say, on a freeway between Arizona and Detroit, in a car with $100,000 in cash, on a road they say is known to be a road used by drug traffickers, they can say, we have probable cause to believe that money are drug proceeds. And so we're going to forfeit that. And you have the ability to come contest it in a lawsuit, or you can just let us take it. And so the way that gets resolved is a number of ways. Sometimes the person contests it and says, that was the money I was going to use to go buy a restaurant in Arizona. Give me the money back. But they have to go to court. They have to hire a lawyer, and they have to prevail in the court. And so, that's seen as being not terribly unfair. What most often happens is the person just doesn't show up. They say, I don't want any more questions to be asked. Just go ahead and take it. So essentially, their money's been taken without any day in court. Maybe it really was drug proceeds. I don't know. But instead of using that guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, with just probable cause, that's not even enough to win a civil case, which requires the higher preponderance of the evidence, takes their money. And sometimes I think what you see is people who are poor or immigrants who don't really understand how the system works, who get stopped. Maybe it's not $100,000, but it's $5,000. They don't really know how the system works. The police take their money, and that's the end. And they never go back. They don't know how to contest it. And so the idea behind it is that if there is probable cause to believe that this is proceeds of a crime, then we should take it as an effort to disrupt drug trafficking. But I think this animal of civil asset forfeiture does create a perception that the police are bounty hunters, that they're out there just taking people's money, that they're shaking them down on the road. And it creates this atmosphere of distrust. And so perhaps limiting asset forfeiture to just the criminal asset forfeiture I described would be a way that would be a compromise. I wouldn't personally end all forfeiture. I think some would advocate for that. But I'm perfectly comfortable with the criminal asset forfeiture, but I think it's the civil asset forfeiture that opens itself up to some abusive practices, and at the very least, a perception that the police are bounty hunters, which is not what we want. We want to think of them as guardians of our communities as opposed to warriors or bounty hunters.
The second part of that question is, do you think this causes over-policing in urban areas?
I don't know. I mean, it does lead to things like taking people's cars for prostitution, for example, or taking cars for people believed to be drug traffickers. I suppose it does provide an incentive for police to just do car stops and on the hope that you'll collect money. I know that I've heard people, police officers, say, it's not difficult to be able to pull someone over. Most motorists at one time or another will fail to come to a complete stop at a stop sign, will cross the center line, will fail to signal properly, may have a tail light out or some other thing. It's not difficult to be able to stop cars. And if you're in an urban area and you want to be very aggressive, you could stop every car that does one of these things. And then you could look for money in the car. I suppose your police are allowed to look anywhere where a passenger might have a weapon. So the seating area of a car. And then oftentimes, because people don't know their rights, they can say things like, "You don't mind if I have a look in your trunk, do you?" And people don't really know better. And so they say yes, which now means they've consented. And so now without a warrant, the police can look in the trunk as well. And I think that is maybe what leads to some of this distrust. Now, police officers in some high crime areas will say, yeah, but I find stuff a lot. A lot of times I find illegal guns, or I find money, or I find drugs. But I think we need to ask ourselves, is it worth it? Right? Is it worth the candle, as they say, to do these kinds of very aggressive stops that results in a breakdown of trust in police officers? And while the police officer is going on this sort of fishing expedition, it means they're not getting to those calls to respond to the scene of a robbery or a carjacking or a sexual assault or something else that causes police to have this perception of over-policing and under-protecting. So I think it is certainly a valid policy question for us to be asking about whether that's good practice for policing.
And this individual just notes that Plymouth Township employs a police officer who works with the Detroit Task Force, and they bring back a share of that forfeiture money.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yes, that is very common. That there is revenue sharing with suburban police departments who participate in task forces for the DEA as well as the Detroit Police Department. And so it is a revenue generating source. I would submit that we should rethink our models for generating revenue in the same way in Ferguson, Missouri. The defense of writing all these tickets was, otherwise we'd be broke. We don't have enough money to keep the court system open or the jails open if we didn't use have our quotas for writing tickets. Well, as a society, maybe we ought to think, if we want things, we have to pay for them. I think sometimes we've been sold a bill of goods by politicians who want to cut our taxes that never go up. We want services, but we don't want to pay for them. Or thinking about the cost of incarceration, and instead of locking people up for 40 years or life, can we suffice with a shorter sentence that frees up some of those dollars to pay for things.
And our next question is, what are your thoughts of Washtenaw County prosecutor and reform changes?
Can you say that again? I didn't quite catch the...
Yep. What are your thoughts regarding the Washtenaw County prosecutor, Savitt, and the reform changes taking place?
Yeah, I think it's exciting. You know, he's someone in a, you know, Washtenaw County is a kind of a medium-sized county, so I think it's a good place for experimentation. I haven't quite decided whether I agree with everything that he is doing. I know one of the things that he wants to do is to not seek cash bail. What I'd rather see is a different kind of system in Michigan, like the one we have in the federal government, which is when people are released on bond, they don't have to pay any money to anybody up front. They make a promise to pay if they fail to appear. And so it has the same kind of incentive or disincentive to run, but it doesn't require money up front, which has a disparate impact on the poor. It becomes a tax on the poor, and it ends up locking up people who can't afford to make bail, and the wealthier people can make bail. So I think his heart's in the right place, but I worry about release of, like, for example, people who've engaged in crimes of domestic violence or sexual assault. Imagine you're a woman who finally gets up the nerve to call the police on your abusive husband. They come in the morning and take him away, and then later that afternoon he's back, and now he's really mad at you. I'm a little worried about that. And I think if instead we had a system like the one we use in the federal system, where the
Got a little frozen here. Sorry, you froze just a moment, but you're back.
Am I back? I would prefer to see a system like the one in the federal system, where all defendants are presumed to be released unless the prosecutor can show that the person is either a danger to the community, like that domestic assault defendant, or a risk of flight, someone who is likely to run away and not come back. And you know, we did that in the federal system. It resulted in about 20% of our defendants being detained pre-trial, about 80% released. And we had very rarely did we have someone commit a crime while they were released or flee, because we were selective but sought to detain those. And then there was no amount of money they could pay to get out. And for those who were released on bond, they made a promise to pay, usually $10,000, and they almost always came back. So I think I would rather see that system than one of cash bail. So I agree with that. So other things, you know, not prosecuting sex workers. I think that this is the way it's been done in most communities already, but the sex workers don't know that. And so if you can assure people that they will not be prosecuted, you will prosecute the Johns and the organizers, the traffickers, then I think they have more of an incentive to seek help. One of the big challenges in enforcing prostitution crimes and sex trafficking crimes is that the women themselves, who are the sex workers, are just as reluctant to call the police as anyone else because they're engaged in criminal behavior, even if the reason they're doing it is because they are being coerced, threatened, plied with drugs, and feel like they have no alternative, are immigrants and fearing deportation and those kinds of things. If you assure them that they will not be charged with a crime, that creates perhaps an incentive for them to seek help. So I think it's kind of exciting. I think he's got some interesting ideas. I don't know if they'll all work out. I hope he has the courage to pivot as needed if things don't work out. But I think innovative ideas are always worth exploring.
Thank you. Next question. How successful do you think lawsuits will be to reverse the multiple GOP voter restriction laws?
I don't know. It's you know, when there are laws that restrict voting rights, then I think there is potential legal remedy there. But there are other things where the courts have been reluctant to get involved. For example, gerrymandering is one that last term we saw the Supreme Court had 2 cases it looked at and declined to get involved because it thought that it's just too political to get involved in deciding how to draw lines. I think if you can demonstrate a true disparate impact on various groups based on race, for example, then that could be a basis for reversal. But for example, the one in Georgia, where they have taken away a lot of the drop boxes in Fulton County, which is the county that had the highest percentage of people who did early voting. If you can show that there is both a disparate impact, a disparate effect, and a disparate intent to reduce minority voting, for example, I think that that one could be successful. They're all a little different. We've had recent lawsuits in Florida and Texas, and so I think we'll see those come to fruition. But it may be that those go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court now, has a much more conservative makeup. But nonetheless, I don't think courts are deliberately political. I think that they tend to reflect the worldview of the party of the politician who appointed them, whether it's a governor in the state courts or the president in federal courts. But I do believe that they try to get it right. And so I hope that for those that do have a disparate impact on minority voters, that there will be a difference. I think one thing that is underappreciated in some of those states is the impact that some of those laws are going to have on rural voters. And that's not a protected class. Our Constitution protects racial discrimination. It doesn't really protect people from disparities based on rural or urban divides. And I worry that there are going to be people in rural communities who have less access to the polls. But I guess we'll have to see how that shakes out.
All right, and for our last question, do you think that privatization of prisons has contributed to the high incarceration rate in the United States?
I don't know, but I am often concerned about privatizing things that are public works because I think it creates profit motives that are dangerous. We did have a situation in Pennsylvania where a judge was being paid to detain children in a juvenile court system because the prison profited from every child who was incarcerated there. So I think it creates a perception of distrust that is not healthy for our system. From time to time, there are people who say, I'm going to run government like a business. And that seems attractive on its face, I think, because I think there's this perception, which I believe is inaccurate, that there's a lot of fat in government. People are just sitting around eating donuts and not really doing anything. And instead, I have not seen that to be the case. And I think that when you privatize things, it creates incentives to make money and make profits as opposed to doing what government should do, which is fulfilling its mission and its obligation to the people. I think we saw this in the Flint water crisis. This desire above everything else to save money led to the poisoning of the community. I don't think by, intentionally in any way, but I think it was a singular focus on the bottom line causes people to disregard other factors that should be more important. And so I do think privatization of prisons is bad policy for that reason.
Very good. All right. Well, again, Carol here from the Plymouth Library. I want to thank you, Barb, for your program today. Very thoughtful, very thought-provoking. Gives us all, in the library world, we all like to learn, and so it gives us greater opportunities for that.
Well, it's been my pleasure to join you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.